And with me today is Beth Dunford. She's the head of the Bureau for Food Security and AID, and the Deputy Coordinator for the, I used to
Deputy Coordinator for Development. Ambassador Garvalik used to have this job before.
I can never remember
the
the full title. But as you've seen from the announcement, Beth has had a long career in AID. She served in Ethiopia, Afghanistan. She was the aid director in Nepal during a tough time with the earthquake there. And she was the development advisor for the special envoy for Afghanistan and Pakistan at the State Department. So she has lots of experience, particularly in the food and agriculture sector. And we're very pleased that you're here. So we'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thanks. Well, I'm a little bit humbled to be here with Ambassador Garvalik. I grew up in USAID when Ambassador Garvalik was leading one of our most important bureaus, and was able to host him out in the field when he came out to Ethiopia during a really important food security crisis in Ethiopia early on in my career. And I remember learning a lot, as I always did when I came into contact with Ambassador Garvalik. And then later, I worked more closely with him again when he stood up the Bureau for Food Security and really helped launch Feed the Future, which is U.S. government's global hunger and food security initiative. So I think really there's a lot to be learned, more to be learned from Ambassador Garvalik perhaps than myself. But I'm excited to be here today to share some thoughts that I have with all of you. I guess it took me a while to really figure out what development was and to become involved with it, and I feel like one of the luckiest people on the planet to be able to spend my life working in development. I grew up with two much older half-brothers. One was career State Department, and one was a career NGO guy doing microcredit out in the field. And so USAID is kind of a hybrid of both of those. So I feel really fortunate to be here. I started out, my first experience, aside from growing up with my brothers, who, of course, came back with tales of yore, wherever they were traveling at the time. But I started out in the Peace Corps, which I think is a really important thing to think about. Living in a village for 2 years gives you an understanding. I always say, really understanding what it's like to be in a village, get that feeling in your bones, because I think it's a really different. It really shows how life is for people who live on a really different scale, I think. So that for me was a very, very formative experience in my life. And after having spent 3 years in rural Morocco as a health education volunteer, I knew that I was hooked and that I wanted to work on development at a broader scale. Peace Corps is really great because you work at that very grassroots level. You are with the people you're touching every single day. But again, it's something that happens at a very, very small scale. And I think, as I grew, I sort of wanted to be able to impact things at a larger scale. And that's where USAID really comes in. Coming in where you're working government to government, setting up broad systems to move change for millions of people rather than just maybe the 200 or 300 that you might be working with in your village. So I think for me, that was the progression. Of course, when I was in Peace Corps, I looked at USAID people and said, oh, they don't really understand what's going on here in the villages. And, they spend their time in different office buildings, and they don't really know what people out here really, really need. And I think that there's an element of truth to that. I think it's really important to always remember you've got to get out there and really interface with people in the field to make sure you know what's going on. But I think there is an ability to sort of impact systems, governments, at scale that I think you have with a place like USAID. So I think it's an exciting way to go, and glad to see so many of you here that are super interested in that. Throughout my career, I started off working in Ethiopia. I think that's when I first encountered Ambassador Garvalik, when he was Deputy Assistant Administrator in the Democracy, Conflict, and Humanitarian Assistance Bureau. Back then, it was just the Bureau for Humanitarian Response. Is that right? That's right. So we were in Ethiopia. I was working under a legend named Tim Shortley, anyway, so we were the Food for Peace officers, so we were responsible for delivering emergency food aid it was 14 million people who needed emergency assistance during one of the biggest drought crises that had happened. So we mobilized 1 million metric tons of food that we got out to people, and also with targeted health interventions and nutrition interventions and egg recovery interventions. Anyway, so again, that's Ambassador Garvalink's very strong background, and it'd be interesting to hear his perspective on how the humanitarian space has changed. But that's how I started out. And then coming out of that very, very difficult food security situation, USAID and also the government in Ethiopia really said, we want to do something different, and started working on what we call the Productive Safety Net Program, which was to say, look, in Ethiopia, we know every single year there are at least, even in a good year, 8 million people who don't have enough to get through the year, that are going to need emergency assistance. And it's really not an emergency if you're doing it every single year. So let's plan differently, be more efficient, be able to get these people their resources in advance so they can actually plan with it and protect their assets in order to be able to not fall further back into poverty. And so that was sort of really looking at how do we get people transitioned off this emergency assistance program. So that was a really formative process. And then I went to Afghanistan, where I worked. I was an agriculture officer, and during an important period in Afghanistan's history, we worked on really rebuilding Afghanistan's agriculture. So I think that coming back to, first of all, let me just also say that another really formative experience for me was to be in Nepal during the earthquake in 2015, and just experience sort of the very, very important work again of OFDA and OFDA, the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance, and the broader humanitarian arm of USAID come in and really provide emergency assistance very quickly in a time of great need, and work on the rebuilding of Nepal, really be able to get development investment in to help people recover after the initial emergency response needs were there. So I've been working on and off on Feed the Future since 2009, which I think is when Ambassador Garvalink joined it. And for me, it's a really important initiative because it takes us to sort of investing in the root causes of poverty and hunger, whereas I think it's super important to be able to come in and respond quickly, and USAID is some of the best in the business on this front. I really was excited to be able to work on the root causes and help people invest in their livelihoods in order to be able to graduate themselves out of poverty and more to self-reliance in their communities and their countries. Having been with this since the beginning and building it, really recognizing where we are today in 2017 versus where we started is huge. We at USAID had just quit investing in agriculture. Basically, I think understanding that after the Green Revolution, everything is all taken care of. We can just check agriculture off the box and move on to other things that were deemed to be more important for investment. But I think that what we saw in the global food price crisis in 2008 was at a time when prices for basic foodstuffs around the world increased dramatically. You saw people suffering greatly, millions of people falling back into poverty, millions more people going hungry, and you also saw conflict arise in many, many different countries around the world where people were suffering from this increase in their staple foods. As you find that sort of poorer populations spend a greater proportion of their income on food, and so when food prices fluctuate dramatically, those are the people that get squeezed the most. And you heard about it. It is a security issue when you actually look at the number of conflicts that came out of just that one crisis. And of course, the connections are far and wide. So through this investment, we've really come to re-engage our agricultural expertise, our programs, getting to engage with countries who are investing their own money in agriculture. We're seeing that since the beginning of Feed the Future in the countries that we've worked, our targeted countries, you've seen an increase of $795 million a year being invested by these countries in agriculture. So really getting those systems working on all fronts, on government side. Another really important part of that is getting the private sector engaged, investing in these places that they haven't really invested in because sort of it wasn't that easy to operate in. They didn't have the right policy environment. They didn't have the right infrastructure. and really seeing what we can do in partnership with countries to get policies right that foster private sector engagement in the private sector, and also get the infrastructure right to allow those businesses to flourish. So through these investments, we've been able to realize that we've seen a 19% drop in poverty in the areas where we've been working, and a 26% drop in stunting, which is a measure of chronic malnutrition over many, many years. So I feel like that's a very, very positive. I feel really proud that we've invested in this and that we've really been able to see the results of it. And we're really excited that the Feed the Future initiative has weathered the presidential transition, and that it is still ongoing within the Trump administration. I think in no small part due to the passage of the Global Food Security Act in 2016 that showed strong bipartisan support in both the House and the Senate. This is in a period where we don't see a lot of agreement from both parties right now on this issue. There was a lot of agreement. We need to be supporting our efforts to end global hunger. And so strong support from Congress for budget, and also the administration is also taking up this issue. So we're excited about that, and we're excited about going forward. So before I close, I just wanted to talk a little bit about how I think development is different from when I started, and if you really want to get a perspective, Ambassador Garvelink should be weighing in on this, because he's been at this for far longer than I am, and
well,
I think
not
we...
that much.
Oh, not that much longer, yeah. But development has really changed since I entered into development. Again, I was a Peace Corps volunteer in the early 90s, but I didn't get into I didn't join USAID until the early 2000s. And so just since that time, development has dramatically changed, recognizing that when USAID started, about 80% of the official development assistance, 80% of the American resources flowing to other countries overseas was from official development assistance. That's either USAID or maybe another agency, but is very much official donor assistance to other countries that was helping them with their development efforts. If you look at that number now, it's only about 9% of the resource flows going from the U.S. overseas to the countries where we work is coming from official development assistance. So that doesn't mean that our assistance has gone down. In fact, it hasn't. But there's been such a surge in resource flows coming from either remittances, or mostly the private sector, or big foundations. And so we're a very small part of the solution now, which is good. This is what you need for sustainability. Really what you need are governments to be taking on their own development issues and resourcing them with their own capacities to be tackling these development issues, and then the private sector to come in and be investing in these small and medium enterprises and input supply dealers, whatever you need to have your agricultural economy start to really flourish. It's this private sector investment bolstered by a good enabling environment from the public sector that's really going to make a difference. So if we're looking at the kind of skills that aid officers need, I think it's really changed a lot since Ambassador Garvelink and I joined, and really needing to focus a lot more on that private sector engagement. So anyway, with those thoughts, I'll just turn it over to Ambassador Garvelink.
Well, we'll open it up to questions, and as you think about questions to ask Beth, I'll start out with one on the Feed the Future related issues. And could you talk a little bit more about your links with the private sector and what kind of activities you've had going on with them that sort of characterize the new relationship?
Great. That's a great question. I think we work with the private sector basically in everything that we do, recognizing first and foremost that agriculture is a private sector enterprise. And so even the smallholder farmers that we work with, they're business people. And so I think just starting from that mindset is the first off. Secondly, there are large private sector companies in the U.S. That we partner with to provide technical assistance and to provide technologies that farmers need. What we bring to the table really are networks of farmers that we're engaged with. And for example, we have a partnership in Ethiopia with DuPont, and they bring some of their latest technologies on seeds and other sort of processing technologies. to the table, and we've organized about 250,000 farmers that are working with DuPont to get these technologies, to get improved seeds, and then when the farmers are finished growing, they have a ready market for offtake of their product. And so I think this is the kind of partnership that we're really looking at. How do we each bring something to the table that we both need for a win-win? We really want to move it beyond sort of the corporate social responsibility, which I think is important. I think companies are recognizing that they do need these sort of social investments, but also where do we get it, sort of where's their core business interest lies, and how can we help incentivize them to take that to some of the countries we're working in. We're partnering with private sector to get better technology to farmers in Guatemala so they can meet increasingly stringent traceability requirements. So this green pepper that was grown on this farm in the hills of Guatemala helped this farmer be able to meet requirements so this pepper can be traced back to this hill and this farmer in Western Guatemala as they want to sell it in the global market. So these are the kinds of things, bringing technologies, bringing private sectors together with farmers at all levels.
Right. Just then, as a reminder, state who you are in your affiliation as you ask questions, so we all know where you're from. Yes, just wait for a microphone, please.
Hi, my name is Elise Green. I'm from the Global Health Policy Center here. I'm an intern. And as someone looking into grad programs in the near future, I was wondering what your thoughts are and really valuable, which programs would probably be the most valuable in terms of finding a job in international development in the future.
Interesting question. I mean, I think there are so many different options. There's finding the technical sector that you really want to work in and finding a graduate program in that. If you're working in health, a master's in public health is always a really, really good idea. I work with many people who are technical Aggies. I think that's really important, but it depends on sort of what sector you want to engage in. I do think that more and more we're seeing master's MBAs be very, very central to what we're doing in development. So I think that there's a broad range of things that you can do. I think it's important to get sort of that, figure out where you want to end up and getting that skill in order to get there. But public policy degrees, I think MBAs are increasingly important, but I wouldn't move away from, I wouldn't discourage, I would also encourage people to really think about very, very technical degrees that's really going to give you a leg up for having that kind of experience and background that people want. I don't know, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, just from my experience, I think more and more an MBA is important. It's interesting as there's a shift in, as you were saying, the resources being provided are going up.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that there's an emphasis on working with local communities and local organizations. At the same time, Congress and our donors are being much more focused on how we manage our money and manage our programs.
Yeah.
So, and in a sense, they're going in two different directions, working more and relying more on local organizations. At the same time, you got to know where every penny goes, and you got to monitor it, and you got to audit it. And I'm sitting in and working with an NGO now, and I'm doing compliance work for them, which is not something I ever thought about during my career. But it is a very big thing now because of the dollars and the monitoring that's going on. So some, if not an MBA, some management courses along the way come in handy. I certainly wish I would have done that. My background is history, which is a fair distance from compliance and audit. But I think those are important fields to at least be familiar with and have some knowledge of as you get into the development business, regardless of what sector you're interested in. There, and then we'll be here.
Hi, Bharath Ram with the CSIS Global Health Policy Center. I'm an intern as well. I kind of have a question about your work, or kind of the future of health and how health has been changing. Recently, it's been reported that NCDs are becoming an increasing problem, especially in developing countries with obesity and diabetes, and that's becoming an increasing concern. So does food security at USAID and other organizations, are they starting to look into that aspect of food security rather than just malnutrition, but also obesity? Is that a problem that you are working on or that you see in the future to be a big issue?
So thanks, that's a very important question, one that is very hotly debated in the Bureau. Malnutrition actually is both overnutrition and undernutrition. And so, anyway, but there's a lot of there are more overly nourished, obese people than there are undernourished people. But I think that the discussion is who are the types of people that we want to be targeting, going after. The poorest of the poor, what are their nutritional issues? And we're finding that, of course, the target population we're looking at, their biggest problem is still undernutrition or not having the right types of nutrients to really balance out their diet. But what you're seeing is increasingly a link between undernutrition and overnutrition. For example, in a place like Guatemala, where stunting in the Western Highlands is at 60%, which is akin to, I mean, it's worse than many places in Africa. It's just crazy given sort of the economic situation there. But you're finding that quickly undernutrition in early life is quickly leading to overnutrition amongst even the poor population living in the rural areas. And so I think that it's still under debate, but it's clear that this is a trend that increasingly we're going to be dealing with in our programs going forward. So.
Hi, Sanne van der Voort. I'm a program associate at the Osgood Center for International Studies. And you talked a lot about the future of public-private partnerships with regards to development. I was wondering if you could maybe expand a little bit on the role of NGOs in the nonprofit sector, if you see that there also will be a bigger role for NGOs in the future of development, or not.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to get your take on that. Ambassador Garveling is now with an NGO, of course, has worked with NGOs throughout his career. I think NGOs will continue to be very, very important. I think that the role that NGOs play has started to shift and will continue to shift to that of capacity building for either bringing together things like farmer groups into farmer organizations, to build the capacity of governments, to help bridge sort of the public-private sector divide that happens. And so I think the role over time is starting to shift and will continue to shift, but I don't see a world where NGOs would not be important. I think also the voice of civil society, local NGOs, building their capacity to engage in the broader development dialogue, I think is super important. What we're seeing is a lot of these fora that used to be government only are now increasingly pulling in the private sector and the NGO sector, the civil society sector, to really get a broader voice at the table. There's the Comprehensive African Agricultural Development Program, which is an African Union-led effort on agriculture. And it started out as being really just governments speaking to governments. And now, over time, a lot of advocacy on our part, really, they're bringing a broader set of inclusive players to the table, which I think is game-changing. So I'd love your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I would agree. I think from my perspective, I always thought of when you're looking at providing assistance, if you want to do something countrywide, you're almost dealing government to government or with the United Nations or a large organization. But if you want to work at the community level, the NGO is the best equipped to do that. And that's what their specialty really is. And that's really important. And I think sometimes when organizations come up with these grand ideas, a lot of technology innovation and all of that, that's sort of ignoring the community level. You got to go down and talk to the folks at the community and see what they need, and their needs may be much more basic than that. And I think the NGOs are best equipped to represent that, facilitate that, work with local communities. And I think as well, I think a lot of private sector companies, particularly in the extractive industries that I've dealt with, rely on NGOs to provide their assistance to communities. Because it is, to get beyond the corporate social responsibility. It's interesting if you talk to, I probably shouldn't say this, representatives extractive industries here in town that work with Congress, corporate social responsibility. That's, they're pushing that. It's 100,000 here, a couple 100,000 there. Then you go to the field and talk to the representative of that company who runs the program in that country. And I say, forget about that. Most corporations are interested in a lot of the same things AID is. They want a healthy, educated workforce.
Yep.
Workforce that will probably become consumers of their products eventually.
Yep.
And say, look, we may have different end games, but we have a very convergence of interest right now, and we've got to work together on that. And they spend hundreds of millions of dollars in that country. It's not the small stuff that comes from the folks here in Washington. So the NGOs play, there's a lot of talk about the last mile to get to the recipient. NGOs, whether it's through the private sector or through donor governments or other organizations, they're the ones generally doing the last mile of assistance, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Bo Wilcox, Osgood Center. So just a quick question for you, Beth. For the 2008 local food crisis, sorry about that, local food, how did USAID respond to these conflict situations? Did they more through a development aspect, or did they play some kind of security role? I mean, let's refer to an organization such as Search or Common Ground. They do conflict mediation, something along those lines. Does a development agency like USAID take role in conflict mediation?
So there are times in 2007, 2008, that wasn't the role of USAID. I mean, there would be emergency response and then really looking at sort of addressing some of the root causes. Again, the causes of conflict are big. There's lots of different issues going on. There's definitely diplomatic and political engagement that has happened at the first and foremost, and I'm going to let Bill talk here in a minute. But we were really looking at saying, okay, food insecurity is a big issue globally. How do we go at the most food insecure places and build the development program? Switching gears a little bit, when I was mission director in Nepal is coming out of a decades-long civil war, 2 decades-long civil war, where we did do a lot of work at conflict mediation in rural areas and places where there had been a lot of violence on both sides, a lot of simmering conflict that still was existent after the peace accords had happened. And so we do play that role at a local level, engaging NGOs to do that conflict mediation often in many, many parts of the world. So I don't know if you have anything else.
Well, not really. I think I think if you're going to deal with conflict issues, you need all parts for the U.S. government, all parts of the U.S. government engaged. You need the diplomats from the State Department. You need development and humanitarian assistance. And if you get past the point with some of the violent extremist organizations that are active now, you need the military to weigh in with their programs. And really, you can't do one without the other in a lot of these. But I think a lot of people underestimate the importance of food security in particular in the origins of some of the disputes that go on. I mean, if you go back to the war in Syria, you can trace the origins back to food shortages and missteps by the government in addressing the needs of agriculturalists in Syria. And that has blossomed into demonstrations where the government reacted violently, and it just went from bad to worse. And now we're years and years into this conflict that heaven knows when it will end. So I think the underlying causes to a lot of these are food related, and it's much more important in minimizing and dealing with it fuels the ethnic tensions and the political tensions between different groups. And you could minimize a lot of the internal conflicts, I think, if we address these basic causes. And that's basic assistance and health care as well.
Does that answer your question?
Let me ask one. I have to, because when I was dealing with food security, it was coming up, and it has continued. How are you guys addressing and dealing with genetically modified food?
Actually, that's a huge question right now because Right now, so genetically modified crops, it's a very big hot button issue. Most countries in Africa, for example, except South Africa, and now I think Uganda is right on the cusp of approving a biosafety law that would allow genetically modified foods. But generally, not accepted, a lot of distrust in a lot of the countries we work with. And the Europeans, of course, will not accept crops that are genetically modified from a lot of countries. So there's also a trade issue. So right now, there's been an outbreak of the fall armyworm. This is a worm that can cause between 35 and 60% devastation of crops. It is endemic to southern U.S. and also Brazil, and has been for many, many years, and has now disappeared in Africa, and it's just like growing, like it's just going like wildfire. It's sort of on the march across the continent, and it's in, I think, like over 70% of the countries in Africa right now. Fall armyworm is really difficult to treat because even just to spray pesticides, you have to spray it at the right time and use the right ones. They become pesticide resistant very, very quickly. They also they burrow into the center of a plant. So if you go and spray after the plant has grown around it, then you can't get to the worm because you're spraying the plant. So just looking at what types of pesticides work, what types of biopesticides there are out there, what other sorts of natural biological controls would there be for the fall armyworm? There's a lot of discussion and debate. It's really difficult to treat here in the U.S. And in Brazil, even though we have very strong infrastructures and extension systems and delivery mechanisms. So in Africa, one of the key ways, here in the U.S. and Brazil, is that we have genetically modified insect-resistant crops. And basically there's this bacteria that's insect-resistant that's found naturally in the ground. What they do is they sort of insert it in the gene of a crop, and the crop as it grows then becomes insect-resistant. So it's a natural biological way to make these crops insect-resistant, so or fall armyworm resistant. And so, it's just bringing up this GMO debate front and center. We, as the U.S. government, there's different views in different parts of the government about what our policy should be trade-wise on biotech. And we at USAID, on a development perspective, very much follow countries' lead on something like biotechnology. And so if there are countries that say we don't accept biotechnology, then we accept that. What we do, though, is help to provide information analytics so countries can make their own science-based decisions around something like biotech and other issues that impact their policy. So does that make sense?
Yeah.
So I think, it's interesting, right now Uganda has passed a biosafety law. It's passed both houses of parliament, and it's ready to be signed by the president. So it'll be interesting to see if fall armyworm is going to be something that pushes a couple of countries over the edge and see what happens.
Do the Europeans, is there any crack in their approach to, because I remember years ago I was at a conference in the UK with a lot of scientists, and they were German and French.
Yeah.
And they were saying, well, hopefully the public comes along with us.
Yeah.
This genetically modified stuff is great, but they don't like it.
Yeah.
And in fact, a lot of scientists have moved to the U.S. and Canada where they can do research.
Right.
Where other places in Europe they can't. And in the UK, there's one farm, I think, where you can do research on this, and that's it. So they've lost a lot of their scientists to moving here.
Yeah.
And so it just seems peculiar that the public doesn't at least pay attention to its scientists.
I think it's something like this. It might take a crisis to sort of get people to think differently. For example, right now we have gained permission to test genetically modified water-efficient maize. Okay, and so there are 6 countries in Africa. One is Kenya, one is Tanzania. I can't remember the others. But they're actually doing field tests. You're not allowed to sort of grow it and sell it and whatever yet, but these field trials are accepted. And this water-efficient maize, it has some some fall armyworm resistant characteristics. It's not the gold standard, but it does have some. And plus, it's very good in water-stressed environments, which is revolutionary for a lot of the places where we're working, where things are changing over time. And so farmers are seeing these plots and saying, well, wait a minute, how come that's growing? How come over here I'm getting decimated by fall armyworm, drought, all these things, I want some of that. And people are saying, oh, no, that's genetically modified. And the farmers are saying, well, wait, I don't care, just get me that kind of seed. So I think things are starting to shift a little bit, but we'll see.
Good.
That started some discussion.
Yeah. And then we'll come up here.
Hi, Barath Ram again. I have a quick question. There's a lot of talk in global health about creating a common health infrastructure to address multiple diseases at one time rather than just a single one. This is especially prominent with infectious diseases. Can food security programs work along an infrastructure like this? And if not, how can USAID or other food security programs work with other organizations to address multiple health issues in a region at a time? If that makes sense.
So again, food security is agriculture and it's nutrition, right? So, and nutrition is a very sort of complicated, multi-sectoral issue. You may know all of this already. So in nutrition, there's there's these sort of clinical health behaviors that came out famously in this 2008 Lancet study. Breastfeeding, vitamin supplements, boom, 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 the things that you could do to really improve nutrition during the first 1,000 days. So a lot of that is very clinic-based and connection with clinics. And so we build on the broader health infrastructure. A lot of it was built through PEPFAR money, whatever else. So I think that, it's just great that the health infrastructure has come up with pulling that all together. A lot of it is really agricultural field-based, are you eating orange flesh, sweet potatoes, or other really healthy diets? And so we're using these health professionals and a lot of these community health workers, frankly, to be pushing those same types of messages. So yeah, we build on that infrastructure. I think that there's differing views on sort of agriculture extension. Do you have a very sort of expensive and complete coverage extension system that's government run to get farmers the right seeds, the right information about what to plant and where, and things like that? We think that there's a good place for government extensions, those types of infrastructures to be built, but really it's in the end, it's private sector, these small ag depots, some of them are connected with larger seed companies, to really have a private sector model to get this information out to farmers, because again, farming is a business, even at the smallest level. So I think there's some sort of combination of public and private effort that is most useful. There are exceptions, like Rwanda and Ethiopia, you've got governments driving a sort of very state-run extension service for their smallholder farmers, and it seems to be working pretty well when you've got the massive amounts of resources and the sort of infrastructure to do it. But building on health infrastructure, I think, is a really good way to make sure that people are eating the right types of foods, but whether or not they can be out there delivering farm inputs, I'm not sure that's going to work, but I don't know. Do you have any thoughts?
No. Go ahead.
Hi, Steve Wright, retired captain, United States Navy. A couple of questions. Risk aversion is preventing public investment or private investment in fragile nations, in conflict areas. How is USAID modifying its program in those particular regions? And does DoD have a role, or how does DoD have a role in food security programs in those fragile nations or in conflict zones?
First of all, interestingly, Boko Haram, for example, as you know, Mercy Corps just did a study that showed that the number one recruitment tool by Boko Haram was financial services, access to financial services, really giving these rural youths, a loan or a grant in order to have them join the organization. So I think the importance of the types of programs we're working on that are sort of agricultural based, which are that's working on rural poverty, are critically important. So how do we operate in these dangerous areas? We have programs up in northeastern Nigeria on the margins of the conflict areas that are doing really important work. Mercy Corps is one of them, to give people an alternative to this grant or a loan from Boko Haram. And we're starting to see real impact. Now, again, whether or not you want to have DoD directly involved in those, I think really they have security platforms that our partners use sometimes when needed. Bill can talk a lot about this. Sometimes they've got money to build certain types of infrastructure that are super useful. I think engagement with the military in these types of areas is a tricky thing. We can't do it without the military, but again, whether you want them directly invested in the programming, I think that's something we usually try to keep separate. But of course, I worked in Afghanistan where I wouldn't have been able to get out to my programs were it not for the provincial reconstruction teams taking me out in their Humvees to get to the sites. But any other?
Yeah, no, I agree. One of the things that I think we have seen over time is the risk aversion of a lot of organizations. And as a result, you see more remote management, where
Yeah.
I know our organization has a lot of programs in Somalia, but our team running those are based in Nairobi, and they go back and forth. And so it's harder to manage your programs and work your programs. And early on, we actually partnered with Turkish organizations that were set up in Somalia, and were able to move around much easier than our folks, and until they got blown up a little bit a year or so ago, and they have their own problems with that. But I think it's a mixture of how you deal with the situations. One of the things that strikes me is you have a really burgeoning, particularly in Africa, youth population, and they're dissatisfied, they're pretty hopeless, and unless the development folks have the opportunity to begin to address these issues, there's a problem that's going to persist for a very long time. I know when I was in the Congo, this was 2007 to 10, we were watching very carefully extremist groups working in poor communities,
Yep.
providing small loans, providing assistance of different kinds. And when you're desperate,
Yep.
looks pretty good. It's something to do when it's hopeless. So I think focusing on the young populations now, and particularly jobs for those folks, the youth, is really important. And it's development folks who do that sort of stuff. And then you get to a point, you can't do it, as Beth says, without the security component to this. Particularly if if you get into it early, it's the development folks and the diplomats, because they're also working at the government level. You can hopefully mitigate this, but once you get past a certain point, the military has to play a very important role with all of its security. I just spent the last week at West Point at a conference, and we were talking about the most forgotten. And those are, in most places, the IDPs. They have nobody to kind of advocate for them, and no international standards. And so that group in particular needs attention. And again, the first responders to this are the development folks and the humanitarian folks to begin to address the causes. And unfortunately, these populations appear primarily in fragile states, which are the least able or willing to take care of them. So again, I think it's got to be a team effort of the diplomats, the development folks, and the military to make it work.
Just quickly, we were talking a lot about sort of physical security, but there's also business risk aversion, right? And that's a lot of what we do that I think has really changed over time, is seeing how we can mitigate risk for the private sector to invest in areas where maybe we're not talking about sort of northeastern Nigeria right now. We could, but how do we get them to invest in, I don't know, a Zambia versus versus South Africa, where they're going to be, they're like, oh, we can definitely make a lot of money in South Africa. How do we say, hey, you know what? We'll mitigate your risk in Zambia. We think there's a lot of good money to be made there. We have this tool called the Development Credit Guarantee, where we work with financial institutions to guarantee their risk. If their loan goes belly up and the person doesn't pay it back, then we will guarantee that loan. It's a way for us to use a small amount of money to really impact a large amount of money, given that just a small guarantee can really unlock 10, 20 times the amount of money of that guarantee. So there are lots of ways we mitigate risk on the private sector side as well.
And that's really important.
Yep.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I have a question for both of you, actually. If you could go into what your specific responsibilities are and what you do in your job on a daily basis, just to have a more specific idea of, yeah, what your job actually looks like.
That's such a good question. Some days is more exciting than others. Well, okay, so this morning I had a little strategy meeting with my senior leaders about focusing on we're going to be looking internally in the Bureau how we organize ourselves to deliver on the global food security strategy that we submitted to Congress. So that's sort of internal organization, how that's going to work. We also talked about how to engage more on what is our strategy, engaging more on getting women entrepreneurs in the agri-food system, especially these small and medium enterprises. How do we get money to these entrepreneurs to be able to grow their businesses, to be able to deliver safe, affordable food to women? So we had a strategy session around that. That's something that's coming up as a big priority in this administration. And so we've got a couple of entry points we test out some work. Then I'm here this afternoon. Then I'm going back to, what's on my schedule? I have to look. Obviously, I didn't get my schedule right since I'm not here at the right time. So, so sorry about that. Sometimes I'm engaging with my boss to let him know, what's happening. Something comes out of the news. He calls me up. What about XYZ? Explaining that. Engaging with our field. Right now, we're doing country plans in each country to see how, let's say, our program in Mali is delivering on the Global Food Security Act. I've got one that's sitting in my inbox. We had a call with the Nepal mission to talk about their country plan. Of course, I feel very close to that program since I was out there for 2 years. We gave them some feedback to make sure that their interventions were big enough to affect the zone. Anyway, so working on that, and I've got to clear some papers and, that kind of thing. Sometimes I'm traveling to meetings in far-flung locales. I don't know. How about you?
Well, I'll just talk about my time with the NGO right now. And when I started with the International Medical Corps a couple of years ago, after I retired from the Foreign Service, I was it was an interesting job. I was running around making connections and developing new programs for the International Medical Corps. And it was kind of nice. They were paying me to go see old friends. I would, from my years, I spent a lot of time.
That's Garlic knows everybody.
Well, you've been around forever. So I would spend a lot of time in Sweden and Norway and Geneva and places with folks I worked with who were in the government there, trying to find out if there's ways to do programs and that sort of thing, and with a bunch of government leaders I knew. And so I was trotting around the world pretty much, having a good time. Then, and I mentioned this early on, with like a number of NGOs, compliance and tracking of funds are becoming more and more important. And we were one of the organizations that got caught in Turkey a couple of years ago with some bad corrupt companies and that sort of thing, and we were taken for a ride. And so compliance became ethics and compliance became a very big thing for the International Medical Corps. So in my case, I had just arrived in Japan from Washington and flying for a couple of days. And I got a call in the middle of the night, and they woke me up, and it was the head of the organization, and said, "You got to take on this new thing. We've got to do something about this compliance." I said, "Okay, whatever." I went back to sleep. I woke up the next morning and thought, "What did I agree to here?" So I've spent the past year setting up a compliance department in the International Medical Corps, where we have compliance officers in most of our countries. We have people in our headquarters in Los Angeles, people here in Washington, people in Split, Croatia, where we have a big office, our finance office. And it's focusing on making sure we're complying with local laws, our own regulations, U.S. laws, the British, because we have a lot of funding from the UK. And it's become a very important thing. And it struck me when I was in the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance, we never talked about this sort of things. And I went to OFDA, the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance, a couple of months ago for a meeting, and there was a woman there, and she's, "I'm the compliance officer." I said, "So you're the compliance officer for OFDA?" She's, No, just for these countries. They must have a whole bunch of them now. And that was not an issue back in when I was in OFDA in the 80s and 90s. And so now it's a big part of development. There's incredible scrutiny by auditors and investigators from every donor government. And I've been with the British, OCHA, the US, obviously, the Australians. It is a big deal now. And so I spend most of my time focused on those sorts of issues. We have a big problem in Yemen right now, as everybody does, so I'm very focused on how our teams are performing there, because we're getting a lot of money for that. I'm heading out to Ethiopia, where we have some issues that I'm concerned with the way we're doing some things. So I'm focusing on how, not the actual, design of the programs, but now I'm looking at it from a compliance perspective to make sure one of the issues you have with NGOs, and particularly one that I work with, which responds to emergencies and primarily in war zones, is they got to get the job done. Well, yeah, but you got to follow the rules and regulations. When the old days with me, that wasn't quite that big of a deal. Humanitarian organizations pretty much got a pass on audits and all this sort of stuff. Well, no more. We're treated the same as DynCorp for inspectors and auditors. So, yeah, we want to respond fast, but now we've got to make sure we do it properly. And so those are the things I sort of keep an eye on. And we're responding in the Caribbean and Mexico yet from earthquakes and hurricanes. And so, again, there's a rush to do things and get assistance to people, but we've got to make sure we're doing it the right way. And that's not necessarily so popular among the humanitarian NGOs.
Yeah.
But, so that's what I do. Oh, over here?
Hi, my name is Chloe Lubin, and I'm an intern at the Osgood Center for International Studies. I had a question regarding your career choices, because you started out in public health issues in Morocco, switched to agriculture, food security, and so even though those are not disconnected topics, how did you decide to focus your career on agriculture and food security? And kind of as a follow-up question, why didn't you choose education or any other topic, and what do you see the future of agriculture and food security be?
So, I mean, part of it is sort of where your career goes. I started out doing health in Peace Corps. I actually started out as an English teacher, and then I said, well, actually, I think what's the biggest problem here is we're working on sort of basic public health issues, so I moved towards health education in the schools. And then I got my degree in sociology, Ph.D. in sociology, where I focused on land tenure in rural areas and got really interested in how people use land in order to promote their livelihoods. And so I did my dissertation research in Mauritania, which I know is not where most people want to end up, but I spoke Arabic already, so that's where I went. And that led me to really start focusing on monitoring and evaluation. As a sociologist, it's very data heavy. You do a lot of surveys and statistical analysis. And actually that's how I got into development, was my ability to do survey and my field work that I was doing in Mauritania. And there was an NGO there that was getting funding from Food for Peace that needed someone to help them set up their monitoring and evaluation system. So that's what I did, is I took those skills that I got from my PhD in sociology, which one would sometimes wonder maybe how transferable the skills were, but actually that data and an analytics piece was super important, and I set up a monitoring and evaluation system, and then I joined Food for Peace. So I started out actually as a humanitarian officer doing food aid, and also setting up for the development program some of these monitoring and evaluation systems. So that's how, you take opportunities as they come. And so some people, I think, are more deliberate and make choices that, they follow, and some of us just grab things along the way. So, I don't know your story. I want to hear it.
Really?
Yes.
Yeah, well, very short. My career has been a mistake.
Right.
From pretty much from the beginning. I was going to be a history professor. That's what I was going to teach, history. My field was colonial Latin American history. And I couldn't find a job after all of that. It's not a real growing field, never was. And so a friend of mine worked on Capitol Hill. So I went to Washington, stayed with him for a few days. I thought, that might not be a bad idea. My wife and I were living in Chapel Hill, North Carolina at the time. So the guy was single, so I slept on the floor of his efficiency apartment from Monday night through Thursday night. I was job hunting on Capitol Hill, and then I go home to Chapel Hill for the weekend, and I come back again. And I found a job working for the House Foreign Affairs Committee. It was great fun. I worked for a congressman from Minnesota, a guy named Don Fraser. And I got there, and he said, "You're going to do human rights." I said, "Well, sure. What do I care? It's a job." So I had the opportunity, though, to work with Hubert Humphrey and Edward Kennedy and some really great guys. I was paid by the House, but I was one of the few who did human rights in those early days. This was in the 70s, and it was great fun. And then Hubert Humphrey died. My boss ran for his job and lost the election, so I lost my job. But I had gotten to know some folks at AID, and they said, "Why don't you come over and work at AID?" I thought, unemployment, AID, I'll do that. And I remember going home the first night to my wife, and I said, "Linda, guess what?" She said, "What?" I said, "I'm a Foreign Service officer." She said, "What's that?" I said, "I don't know." That's how I was sworn in as an auditor. That's how I came into AID.
Oh, interesting.
And I lasted a year, and then I switched into the regular part of AID, into the policy office, focused on Africa, and I wouldn't change a minute of it. But it was not anything I had planned.
When did you get into OFDA?
Well, I got into AID in 1979, and I went to Bolivia for 5 years. 85, I started in OFDA.
Oh, so you had a whole career before that, yeah.
I was at PRM for a couple of years, and then off to. But anyway, I guess my advice is always don't plan too much.
Exactly. Just take what comes up.
There you go.
What you love, and if you love it, you're going to do well at it.
Yeah.
If you hate it, oh, here's the slog, it's not going to happen.
That's right.
Yeah.
So anyway, yes. I want to hear more about her now.
So just a quick question. You, sorry about that. You mentioned remote management of certain programs. Could you just walk through the process of what that is? Like heavily dependent on technology to keep in contact with the personnel in the conflicted area, or?
Well, I was talking about it in terms of the NGO I work for, and that is your staff. I'll use Somalia. Is about 95. We have about 5,000 or 6,000 people around the world, but 95% of them are local or third country nationals. And so in Somalia, we only have Somali staff. Our folks in Nairobi, who are actually Brits, go in and out for a day or two at most, and then come out. And it's the Somalis on the ground who are running things. So we're in contact with them daily through Skype, email, and all this sort of stuff, but we do not have expatriates on the staff and on the ground managing programs and working with the local with our local staff. They're pretty much on their own. We're taking advice and consultation with the folks in Nairobi, but we're not like in another program. You're all living together and working together in the country. So that's sort of what I meant.
Yeah, and just to add on to that, I mean, I think having local staff manage programs is a lot of how we operate in very insecure environments. I mean, in Afghanistan, that's how we did it. There's also the piece of needing to sort of oversee and make sure things are going well. And so there's a lot of third-party monitoring where you bring in another group that either uses local staff to go and check on what's going on. This is really that accountability piece, right?
Yep.
It's programmatically to make sure that you can make adjustments to make sure you're being as impactful as possible, make sure the money is going where it's supposed to be going, that kind of stuff. So the third-party monitoring is a big deal. And there's also increasingly use of some sort of geospatial data information to be able to monitor. And we're pushing on that even in places that aren't insecure to see how we can more cheaply and quickly and routinely get information on what we're doing. Mercy Corps, again, I don't know why I keep bringing up Mercy Corps, but in Nepal, they're using cell phone data to monitor sort of response to shocks. So with the theory that in Nepal, people use cell phone usage is very pervasive even in the rural areas, and people have pay-as-you-go SIM cards, and so they can get the data from the SIM card sellers or whatever to see, what's the volume of people buying minutes on their phone and using minutes on their phone. And so if they're going through a shock, like there's a drought or there's some sort of price issue that's causing them difficulty, you're going to see the cell phone minutes go down. And so that's a real sort of remote way to really track how people are doing. There's also remote sensing. They're getting a lot better at using sort of learning models to sort of mirror, night lights with tin roofs, with, all those different things to get sort of an estimate of poverty. So we're really pushing on that to be able to better monitor things remotely in all environments for cost, but it also really helps in these insecure environments as well.
Yeah. Okay.
And Beth, I don't know whether you want to address this. I've been to a couple of events here in the recent past talking about Ray Tillerson's reorganization. There was that big fear-mongering for a while that USAID would be brought into DOS. I understand that that's been avoided. But do you know what the status is? Has there been a specific administration decision that, yes, USAID is going to be an independent organization? And the follow-on question to that is, as you look at the 6 think tanks who have done studies of this, all of them are recommending the same thing as far as making USAID the central authority for all aid, raising the administrator to a cabinet level. Any chance of that stuff happening?
So Deputy Secretary Sullivan, in his testimony, which is available online, said that a state and aid merger is off the table. So yes, the administration has made a decision on that. That is not happening. And so within that, I think that we're in a really good place. We have very strong support from Congress. We have Ambassador Mark Green, who is amazing. He not only really knows this stuff, has a very strong background and a really important experience that he's bringing to this position. He also has a lot of strategic ideas and how to make USAID a better organization, and also has strong connections throughout the legislative and administrative executive branch. So I think that we're in a good place with all of this. There are a lot of sort of details that are still being worked out and redesigned, but I think Deputy Secretary Sullivan took merger off the table, and I think what we're doing is seeing how we then get better at doing what we're doing. So yeah.
And I think a big supporter of AID has been the military.
Huge supporter, yeah.
Has the office, I worked with the office a couple of years ago, that had all of the COCOM liaison people in it. I mean, it was right there in your headquarters at the Reagan building. But I could tell you that the 05s and 06s manning those desks had some questions about really if they were adding value. I mean, there was there was still quite a wall based on historical and cultural differences between USAID folks and the military on site. Has that improved? Is there closer coordination at the headquarters, or is the primary node of coordination still on the ground in the specific fragile nations like Afghanistan, or perhaps, Afghanistan or the Sahel?
So I think that it's pretty context specific, and but I will say one thing since I joined, and would really like your input on this too, but your perspective. Since I joined, the perception and relationship between USAID and the military has changed dramatically. I think in the beginning, the aid officers were generally, if you could stereotype, very reticent to engage at all with the military. It was a little bit different on the emergency side because you don't really have a choice. But I think your typical aid officer was very resistant and wanted to really draw sort of boundaries between USAID and DoD. I've seen that change over time, where it's expected that we will all be at the table together and recognizing that we can't get this done without the development, diplomacy, and defense at the table together, and recognizing that we all have different strengths to bring to the table. So I think that the understanding and the value that we see in other organizations has really, really changed for the better.
Yeah, it's, the first contact really was very interesting. It was in Turkey after the first Gulf War in 1990. And I was on a team going in and went into a refugee camp, and I ran into the special forces in the camp. And they were immunizing kids. And I was kind of said, what are you people doing here? And they said, well, how do you think we figure out what's going on? We talk to the women, immunize the kids, we just kind of blend in. And then we were sent after the Gulf War and all the Kurds went up in the mountains by the Secretary of State Baker. And the military was coming out, and Secretary of Defense sent civil affairs and special forces guys into the mountains. So we didn't know we were going to run into the military. That's the first time in operations, other than logistics, which is what the military normally did, that we ran into each other implementing programs. And there were NGOs who were horrified.
Yeah.
The UN was very schizophrenic. And that was the first time the two were working together. And it's moved, as Beth said, miles since then. It's far, far better than in those days in 1990. So we've moved a long distance in a relatively short period of time.
Yeah, and I think the military understanding of development has really dramatically improved. My first experience working closely with the military was in southern Ethiopia, where we were working very hard to develop these community animal health worker programs, basically try to get sort of very community-based private veterinary services out to areas where government extensionists were never going to reach. And how do you get some guy in a village to be able to sort of treat your basic diseases and have the basic vaccines and medicines that animals might need, given that this was sort of their lifeblood. And so, it took a long time to really build these private sector outlets in very remote areas. And then just as we get them up and running, the military would come in and vaccinate all the animals, which was sort of taking revenue away from these private sector actors that we'd painstakingly developed over years. And so I think that you don't see that kind of stuff happening anymore. There's a real understanding of needing to coordinate in advance and then understanding how each other does business. So.
Yeah. Well, being very conscious of your time and yours.
So I'm sorry I was not conscious of your time earlier,
we were supposed to go till 12:30, so this worked just right. So please join me in thanking Beth for being here.
Thank you all.
This is great.